In today's video, we are going to be talking about the core, what the core is, how it works, and how we can effectively train it as a wheelchair user. The core is like the foundations of a house, and just like everyone else, it's super important for our posture, stability, and performing daily activities. But when you look online and you search for core activities, most of them are stuff that we simply can't do as a wheelchair user. So how can we actually train it? Well, that's exactly what's going to be coming up in today's video. But before we talk about the exercises themselves, let's talk about actually what the core is and what it's actually doing. So when we talk about the core, we're not actually talking about just the abs on the front, the six-pack. There's much more to it than that. In fact, it's every muscle that makes up any sort of spinal movement. You could think of your core like a cylinder that wraps around your body and involves several different muscles. Yes, it includes the abs, but it also has the transverse abdominis, the obliques, muscles in your back. The core helps with stabilizing your body, assisting in other movements as well as movements of their own, and helps with things like posture as well. And like I've already mentioned, it's kind of like the foundation of a building. When it's strong, the rest of the body is strong too. But if you have a weak foundation, the rest of the house is weak too. Before we dive into the rest of this video, I just want to explain, because there is a lot of different people with a lot of different abilities who watch this YouTube channel. So I do understand that some of you have great core already, some of you may have a slightly weakened core, some of you might have a very weakened core, and some of you might not have any ability to use your core whatsoever. So this is more of a general term of how you can work your core. Take what you can from the video and learn what you can and apply it to your ability levels. With that said, let's get on with some of the actual information. Now, when we're talking about the core, the main thing is that we're talking about movement. And what can the core actually do for us? Well, it actually comprises of 4 different movements. We've got flexion, extension, rotation, and lateral flexion. We're going to talk about those 4 coming up, but we're also going to be talking about anti-movement as well. A little bit more about that coming up. But let's first start off with flexion and extension. Simply put, flexion is where we curl forwards, and extension is where we sit up straight. Nice and simple. It's almost like taking this laptop hinge and bending it down, which is flexion, and putting it back up, which is extension. But it's a little bit more complicated than just a simple one bend. Because our spine is made up of multiple vertebrae, it's more of a curling over function when we do our flexion. So it's not just hinging at the hips, think of it as curling forwards. That's flexion. And then the opposite is the extension, the act of sitting up tall. Next up is our rotation, which is simply rotating one side and to the other side. You probably do this quite a lot in daily life if you're ever reaching for something, looking behind you, maybe someone's calling you from behind, you look over, that's you rotating. And just like the flexion extension, it's the core muscles that are facilitating that rotation. And lastly, we've got lateral flexion, which is similar to flexion, but instead of going forwards, we're curling over to each side. And you'll probably use this again in everyday life when we reach down and pick something up off the floor, or reaching over to grab something off of a shelf. That's when we're laterally flexing. Every movement that you do that involves the core uses one or more of these types of movement. Whether you do flexion, extension, rotation, or lateral flexion, or a combination of 2 or more of these movements, you're going to be working your core muscles. And we'll talk a little bit later in the video about how we can exercise each one of those types of movements. But I also mentioned anti-movement. And what do I mean by that? Well, essentially the core is all about stability as well as movement. So we want to be able to resist movement as well as being able to move effectively. So a good strong core doesn't have just a good flexion, it also is the ability to resist that flexion, as well as resisting the extension, rotation, and lateral flexion as well. And anti-movement exercises are super important, especially for us wheelchair users, and is probably one of the most effective ways for us to train it as well. More on that later. And the reason for that is because we're sat down all day in our wheelchairs, and even if you're a manual wheelchair user or a power wheelchair user, if you're going over a rough surface, you're using that anti-movement to stop yourself falling out of your chair. Now, obviously, for some of those with weaker core or less core, we do use our wheelchairs a bit to help support it, but it's always a good idea to have as strong a core as you can for any of those situations that our wheelchairs can't support us in. For example, if you transfer out your wheelchair onto a bed, you need that core to keep yourself upright and stable. The more stability you have in the core, the more able you are to do things both in your wheelchair and out of your wheelchair too. Okay, let's talk about some of those exercises themselves that work those different types of movement and the anti-movement. And the first one here, we need to get a little bit creative with. See, when we're doing flexion exercises, if you weren't a wheelchair user, you would usually do something like a sit-up, but that's going to be almost impossible, or actually impossible for most of us here. So we need to get a little bit creative. And to do that, we can use a resistance band. if we tie the resistance band up high or use a partner to assist, we can wrap it around our chest and flex down against the resistance of the band. So instead of going against gravity with our body, we're going against the resistance of the resistance band. Now with extension, we don't necessarily need a resistance band for this because we've got what we need because we're already in a sat up position. So if we use gravity to assist us in this exercise, we curl forwards and then sit up straight. That alone is going to be working the core muscles that allow for extension. However, for some of you, that may be perfectly fine. The others, that might be too easy. So we can make it a little bit harder, either by having our arms up in a higher position. Higher arms up, the harder it is because you shifted your center of gravity. Or we can make it harder by adding weight to the situation, therefore adding more resistance and intensity to the exercise. Have a play around and find out what works for you. On our rotation, we can go back to using a resistance band, but instead of tying up high this time, we tie it up around about chest height and sit perpendicular to that anchor point. From here, we can grab the band and rotate to the side. Remembering though, we want to rotate to both sides. So once you've done one side, turn around and do it on the other side as well. The key here is to go nice and slow and controlled on this exercise and all of the other core exercises as well. And lastly here, for the lateral flexion is a side bend exercise. For this, you take one dumbbell in one hand and you lean down to the side and sit back up straight again. Do the amount of reps you need to do on one side, then switch the dumbbell over to the other side and repeat. You can adjust this by either having no weight, that might be enough for some of you, or if you need to get a heavier weight, get a heavier weight. I will say with this though, don't put two dumbbells in two hands to do this workout because otherwise one weight counteracts the other and makes this easier than it should be. So what about the anti-movement exercise we can do? With this, we don't want to move against the resistance, we want to resist against the resistance. So to give you one example, let's go back to the one where we did on the rotation. Instead of rotating around to one side and back again, we can sit at that perpendicular angle and hold the band still at the halfway point. Our body wants to go back to the anchor point by rotating, but we're not allowing our body to rotate. That is anti-movement. And we can also change up the angles by going higher, lower to add some more in to get a good anti-movement exercise in. Now there's quite a lot of exercise you can do in anti-movement, so I'm not going to go into all of them here, but I just wanted to give you the general idea of anti-movement exercises. Now, if you did want a workout that contains a lot of these exercises for both movement and anti-movement exercises, I've made YouTube videos in the past that go through core exercise routines. But if you want a more structured program that includes both core training and other types of training as well, then I recommend you sign up to my membership site by clicking on the link down below. So let's recap here. Core muscles are the muscles that move our spine in flexion, extension, rotation, and lateral flexion. They help with stability and keeping us strong. And we can train them by going through those movements against resistance or doing anti-movement exercises resisting the resistance of whatever we're doing. All of these help to make our core a nice strong foundation that allow us to do our daily activities much more effectively. But if you do have any comments, questions or concerns about anything I talked about in today's video, let me know in the comments section down below. Thank you very much for watching. If you did like the video, hit the like button. If you're new here or you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more great videos just like this one. Thanks again for watching and I'll see you next time. Goodbye. Are you ready to start your fitness journey? Then sign up now at adapttoperform.co.uk and get access to hundreds of workouts specifically for us wheelchair users.